Login accepted.
All right, so we're gonna get started now. So who am I? My name is Josh. I'm a comps developer here at Swift, and then I was on Cyberforce last year, and I'm currently on the NCAE team. Quick announcement. So we do have the CIS banquet coming up, right? This is a good opportunity to network with other students. And then if you're interested, feel free to RSVP using the QR code. I can come back to it later if anyone's interested. Yeah. So the table of contents for today. So first I'll be going through, threat hunting, kind of, looking at the machine and seeing, what's on it, what's wrong with it. And then afterwards I'll be going through a little bit of access control and privilege management. And then I'll move on to network and system hardening controls. And then at the end, I'll give a brief kind of introduction to the workshop we'll be doing on Friday. All right, so first, I just wanted to talk briefly about the system compromise lifecycle. So, how exactly, does a machine kind of get compromised, right? And it typically starts with some misconfigurations, right? Some vulns, and then using these vulns, people can get, initial access. And when they do get initial access, of course, their permissions might be limited. So they're going to find a way to escalate to the root user. And then once they have root privileges, they'll typically open their own ways for them to get back into the box. And that's called persistence. So service misconfigurations, I think a really common one is weak or insecure default settings in the configuration file of a specific service. I think a really common one is SSH. SSH is a really important, you know, service that's used, and insecure default setting can actually be, allowing someone to connect using their password. A lot of times with SSH, it's it uses key-based authentication, which means the clients, right, the person who's trying to connect to the server will, send the server their public key, and then the server has the public key stored um in that specific user's home directory, and then using that, whenever the user wants to connect to the server, it'll show them, hey, I have the private key to this public key stored on the server, and through that, it'll give it access. Another one is outdated or vulnerable service versions. I think a really common one is VS FTPD 234, which I'll talk about briefly in the next slide. And then the last one is unnecessary or exposed services running. If you don't expect anyone to use that service, it shouldn't be on the computer. I think it just gives it more ground for attackers to attack. So here on this slide, so the first two images on the top, right? So this one right here, this is a Kali machine that's on the same network as the vulnerable machine, right? So what I've done here is I've just used FTP and then the IP address of that machine, right? And then here it says I'm connected to the machine. And here, it says the specific version of the service running, right? And you see it's 2.3.4. Now, this specific version is actually vulnerable because, it basically has a built-in backdoor to it, right? So when you do establish a connection and you have a specific syntax in your username, um, it'll open up a port on that machine and then you can connect to it, right? So the syntax is actually just a smiley face. So if you type in any user and then at the end you type in a smiley face and then you go to the password, you don't have to enter anything. You just hit enter, right? It'll hang, right? And then what I did here is I opened up another terminal and I used Netcat, which is a networking utility, and I basically, you know, um, I requested to, connect to this machine on this specific port. And then you can see here, I got the connection. And then if I type in who am I, I'm root. and then print working directory, I'm at the root directory, which is the very top of the Linux file system. And down here, this is just something I touched upon briefly in the previous slide. This is some SSH configs, right? So here we have permit root login, yes, password authentication, yes, and permit empty passwords, right? And this is pretty common sense. You don't want to have any of these enabled if you truly want your SSH server to be secure. So moving on to some system misconfigurations, right? So here we have weak or excessive user perms, misconfigured sudo privileges. Sudo stands for super user do, right? You're basically temporarily running a command with elevated privileges. And then you have world writable files or directories, disabled logging or auditing, and missing security updates and patches. So here, you see I'm currently on the Vuln machine. And then if I, list, um, so the Etsy password is the file in which a lot of the user account information is stored. And you can see here, right? It has read write for the owner of the group and others. So anyone can make changes to this file, which is pretty dangerous. You don't want that because, someone can get on the machine and then they can edit the file and add in another user here, right? You see Wilbur, right? And then you see his UID is 0 and his group ID is 0, which basically implies that he's the root user, He can do everything that root can do, and then you see he has a home directory here, and then his login shell is a bash shell. So when he logs in, he has a root shell. And then down here is an instance of a sudo misconfiguration. So here you see, what this means is that the user can run sudo commands, but when they run the sudo command, they don't need to enter their password or anything, right? And below that, you see, as user, I just ran sudo bin bash, and then now, I have a root shell. Something quite important when you first, you know, get access to a compromised machine is reconnaissance. And here, I have two specific softwares here. I have Nmap and then I have socket statistics, right? And Nmap is typically used outside by attackers to kind of see, what are some openings which the attacker can attack the machine, right? And it shows the externally listening ports, and you can't see anything listening internally, right? And in here, socket statistics is used typically by the defender when you're inside the machine, right? You use it, you can see all the listening ports, and you can that includes everything running listening internally on the machine. So here, I just ran sudo ss. SS stands for socket statistics, right? And then I have a few arguments in the back here, right? TULPN. And then here I kind of just elaborated a little bit more on what those arguments, or sorry, not arguments, options, what those options actually mean. And then here we see the TAC-T stands for TCP sockets, TAC-U stands for UDP sockets, TAC-L stands for basically anything that's listening for a connection, and then TAC-P is for processes, so it shows the name. It shows the name of the process here, and then it shows the ID. Um, and then to see this, you need to run it with sudo, right? So you see I ran it with sudo here. And then TAC-N, it just shows the port number, what it's running on. And then here you see there's the local address and then there's the peer address. So local address is on, the server side, meaning, what is it listening on, right? So if it's 0000, that means, it's accepting anything from from it's accepting any connection, right? And then the peer address will just be, the IP of what's actually connecting to it. And in here, I have a screenshot of Nmap on the Kali machine, right? So TAC SC, it, it's running some sort of default script. I don't know exactly in detail what it's running, but it's running some sort of default script. And then TAC SV just stands for the version, right? It'll tell you the version of the service here, right? You see that, it sees that FTP is open listening on port 21 and the specific version is 234. So if an attacker saw this, you'd be like, oh, it's 234. So they can, if they know the vuln, then they can exploit it. So initial access, this is pretty, you know, if you read initial access, you could probably get an understanding of what it is, right? It's basically the point at which an attacker first gains a foothold onto a system or network. And, initial access can, lead to immediate, like, whole compromise of the machine. You know, if someone gets initial access and they have, already elevated privileges, if they're already root, there's no need for them to priv S. So here we see that I'm on the Kali machine, and then on the Vuln machine, it's running a simple Apache web server, right? And then you see here, there's this dot shell dot php, which is a PHP web shell that's in the directory, the root web directory. And you see I'm able to navigate to that, and then I'm able to type a command here, who am I? And it tells me I'm www data. Now this is just a, kind of a low level system user. It's it's here because a lot of the times, Apache actually, it receives a lot of information that, and that information may or may not be secure, right? So if they did receive some sort of malicious request, right? And then the Apache web server was running as root, here it would actually display root instead of www data. So I'll kind of talk about that later, but it's called a least privilege, right? Basically, you're just giving um, resources and users the minimum amounts of um, resources they actually need to function. You don't want to give them anything, right? So here's privask, right? If they gain initial access to a system and they have limited privileges, then they'll find a way to obtain higher permissions. So here we see an example of an SUID bit, and what that means is, that specific. So here you see there's a read write and then there's a S, right? And what the S stands for is, it runs as the owner of the binary. So you see here the owner of the binary is root, right? So whenever you run, this find binary, it'll run with root privileges here. So here you see I have find dot, which means, you're just using the command in your current directory, and then the tag exec exec means execute, right? So you're executing this command, which is a bash shell. And then the tag p actually stands for, maintaining your privileges. Actually, Linux has a built-in function where if it sees that a binary is running with a SUID bit, it'll actually purposely drop it, as a as for security reasons. But then if you do the tag B, you're basically telling it, don't drop the function. I mean, don't drop the privileges, right? So then you see here, I have a, a root shell here. So, and then now we come to persistence, right? And like I said earlier, persistence is really just a way for the attackers to stay on the machine afterwards. If there's a reboot, if they log out, or if the initial access phone that they use to get onto the machine is patched, right? And we see that it enables long-term presence on a system. It's often implemented through automated or hidden mechanisms, and it supports continued activities such as data collection or lateral movements. So here, um, you see, there's a service running here, right? And this is the service config file, and you see in here it has a description, system update service, it's just the name, and then the start limit interval second here basically allows it so that the service can continually run even if it fails, right? And in this case, the service here is a is a reverse shell. A reverse shell meaning that the vuln machine will actually is the one initiating access to the attacker's machine here, right? So then we see here bin bash taxi, which means, run everything in the quotation marks as a command, right? So you have uh, bash tag I, and then you have this part right here, the slash dev TCP. This is the IP of the Kali, right? 4444. This is what's initiating the TCP connection to that machine there, right? And then here we see restart always. We always want the service to restart. Whether or not it receives a connection or not. And then it waits 10 seconds before restarting every time. And then here you see, I'm on the Kali, right? And this time, I'm the one that's listening, right? I'm listening, and then, the reverse shell will connect to my machine automatically. So, of course, there's many different ways of, initial access, priv-esc, persistence, but this is just an example. It's an idea to see, how these attackers can maintain access to your machine. So moving on, we'll be talking a little bit about, access control and privilege management. So I mentioned this earlier, right? Least privilege, you should only have the minimum permissions required to perform their tasks. And then, going back to the web shell, right? If Apache web server was running as root there, the attacker would have had root access there. So it's really important, to only give things the permissions that they need. Don't give them anything else, right? Don't give them any ground to attack you. So here, we have the basics of user account management, right? So we have etc password, which is the file that stores account information. And then, you would think etc password stores a password because that's the name of the file, but it doesn't. It's actually etc shadow. And here you see it stores the password hashes, password policies, and it's only readable by root. So when you are kind of viewing these files, what you want to look for, accounts with UID 0, that means they have root privileges. Service accounts with login shells. These service accounts are typically, very low level access, they're not supposed to really have anything more than that. And then you have unused or default accounts, empty passwords. If you do have access to Etsy Shadow and you read the file and you see there's no hash, that means the user doesn't have a password, right? And also to be aware of users and privileged groups, the pseudo groups. Wheel is just it's pretty much the same thing as a pseudo group, but it's for other distros of Linux, uh, like Red Hat and CentOS. So file privileges, like I mentioned, as you saw in the screenshots earlier, a lot of them, you would see the file privileges, right? Read, write, and execute. Read is, just viewing the file. Writing means you can make changes, modify the file, and execute means, you can run that file. And incorrect permissions allow unauthorized modification or execution of files. And we see here, right, misconfigured privileges like the SUID binary on the find binary, right? That allowed it to get root access. So now we'll be moving on to some network and system hardening controls. And when it comes to really securing your system, firewalls are extremely, extremely important. And the purpose of a firewall is to determine, what traffic goes in and out of your machine. And typically, we categorize it by ingress and egress. Ingress, which is incoming traffic to the system, and egress, which is outgoing traffic from the system, right? So here I just listed, some best practices. Typically, in a competition, if your machine is being scored for a certain service, then you want that port to allow incoming traffic, right? But if there's a um another service listening on another port, and that port is not being scored, then you know you shouldn't be allowing, connections to that port, because that just gives the attackers more opportunities to attack you, right? And when you are setting your firewall rules, you can restrict access by IP, but do be careful. I think Ryan had mentioned, in the NCE trial, some people, you know, they made it so that, they would allow all connections coming in from the IP of the scoring engine. But, the scoring engine was actually changing IPs, right? So they basically screwed themselves over. So do be careful when you are restricting access by IP. And so now we talked about incoming traffic, right? What about outbound traffic, right? Well, it's actually not as simple as just blocking all outbound traffic. Actually, if you do that, um, you can break system updates. Your machine cannot send DNS requests, and you can't install anything because you don't have access. You pretty much don't have access to the internet. Um, and just be cautious when you're setting your firewall rules, right? Uh, you know, Misconfigured firewall rules can be misleading. For example, if you do block all outbound traffic, right, and then you try to ping, let's say 8.8.8, which is Google's public DNS server, you're like, why can I not ping it? It seems like you don't have internet connection, but the reason is, you're blocking all outbound traffic, which includes ICMP packets, right? So do be careful when you're setting up your firewall rules. Right, so I think a really common, firewall software that's used to configure these rules is IP tables. Now there are other softwares like, UFW, Firewall D, um, NF tables, but I put IP tables on the slide here because it's the one I'm most familiar with and I have worked with the most, right? So here we see these three rules here. Default deny policy, right? So you see it's dropping all incoming connections, right? It's dropping all forwarding connections, and then it's dropping all um, outbound connections. But actually, if you just set these rules, you pretty much are gonna break your system. So you wanna, add some other rules that allow the machine to still function properly, right? And a really important one is allowing loopback. A lot of the times, the system needs to talk to itself. And so it's important to allow loopback, right? This is just for the functionality of the machine. It's so that the machine can still operate properly. And in here, right, we have allow established and related connections, right? So let's say you're SSH'd into a machine, right? And then you set the rules so that port 22 isn't listening for connections. You know, because you have these established related connection rules, you're actually not going to get kicked out of the SSH connection, right? Because you're already connected to it. So you would still have that SSH session going. But then if you were to exit out of that SSH session, you wouldn't be able to get back in because you didn't make it so that it was listening on port 22. And here, we see some allow DNS rules, and these rules are specifically for the client side, right? The client side. So if your machine was the one that needed to make a DNS request, yes. Um, that's a good question. Um, Yeah, I actually don't know. Yeah, sorry. I'll get back to you on that. That's a good question. Yes, Ryan. Yeah, established related basically means, the connection. So let's say, you have your machine is sending a DNS request to the server, right? But then you're not accepting incoming connections uh on port 53. You will actually be able to receive that so if you're sending a DNS request, right, you will be able to receive some sort of response back, even though you're not, allowing inbound connections on port 53 because, the connection is already established and related, right? Um, okay. So here, sorry, this comment right here is wrong. This is just an example, right? If your machine was a web server, of course the request would be an HTTP request or HTTPS request. So you would need to allow um oh sorry, this output should be input here. You would allow connections on port 80 and port 443. So moving on to backup and recovery, right? A lot of the times, if a red teamer does get access to your machine and then they see, they could easily delete config files on your services, stuff like that, right? So it's important to maintain backup and recovery just so you can kind of bring it back up as fast as possible without having to, manually retype and fix everything. Um, so one way to do that is using SCP, secure copy, but this actually uses the SSH protocol. So if you don't have SSH enabled, then you wouldn't be able to use this, right? So that's kind of one caveat when it comes to using a secure copy. Um, and here, I just have an example, backing up IP table rules, right? So you see here, there's a pseudo binary called IP table save. And what this binary does is it basically just, it gets all of your current IP table rules and it just copies it over to whatever file you redirect it to. And then here we see there's another one, IP tables restore. This is basically pulling the information from the backup file and kind of reestablishing those rules, right? And do verify backups regularly to ensure they can be restored, especially if your backups are on that same machine. Make sure they're still there. Make sure they're not deleted or something. Yeah. So now I'll be giving a brief introduction to the live hardening workshop, right? So it's pretty simple. You just have a Ubuntu um, machine, and this machine is intentionally vulnerable, right? And you guys will identify and kind of exploit the vulns, and then you can use the Kali machine is for you to kind of test those vulns, and then after fix those vulnerabilities, you can kind of test it out again to see how it acts, right? And then I'll publish the template either later today or tomorrow. Um, and the router, don't touch the router. You should already have internet access, everything like that. And the two machines should be able to connect to each other, right? They should be able to talk to each other directly. Um, yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you guys for listening. Any questions? Okay, if there's no other questions, hope to see you guys on Friday for the workshop. And thank you guys for coming. Thank you guys for coming.